whatever you can do or dream that you can do, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Goethe.
Sharon, I've just read your book, The Power of Impossible Ideas, and I'm seriously thinking about going to Russia with my camera, and I have a lot of questions. To start with, you've been traveling around within Russia for over 30 years?
Well, actually it's been 33 years, Mel, and what took me there was the relationship between the United States and the USSR. At that time, we had 50,000 nuclear weapons. They had 20,000, we had 30,000. And it could be predicted that at some point, somebody was either going to have an accident or some of these weapons would be fired. Our Union of Concerned Scientists said at that time that if even 10% of the arsenals were fired, this would mean that the Earth would be a cinder traveling in space forever, because the impact would absolutely take out the whole planet. So for me, this was not okay, because I had 4 children. They were in high school, going into college or universities, and I wanted a future for them. I wanted them to be able to realize their dreams, to live. I wanted every child to be able to have that opportunity to live. And it was not okay with me that we had all these weapons on the planet, and something had to be done with the relationship between the two countries. So if nobody was doing it, I decided that I would do it.
So, Sharon, what was your impossible idea?
Well, since the government couldn't do anything, or governments couldn't do anything to stop this, I decided that maybe the citizens could. Now that's a pretty impossible idea, right?
Right.
So I decided I wanted to take a group with me because I was too chicken to go by myself. And I started talking with my friends about it, and they were interested, and together we came up with a group of 20 people plus 4 people as a camera crew that went. Now before this, I had gone to the Soviet consulate in San Francisco and asked them if I could get permission to take a trip to their country, because I would like to get off of out of the hotels, off of the tour buses, and I'd like to go to the streets and see what their people are really like. And so I asked this young consulate person, could I do this? And he said, well, I don't know. Nobody's ever asked us this before. And so he said, I'll tell you what, I will get in touch with Moscow. If you'll come back in 2 weeks, I'll have an answer for you. And so in 2 weeks, I went back. And I was scared to death when I went into that place. I felt like I might disappear and be put in a gulag and never be seen again. But as it happened, this young man, I think, believed me. He questioned me and wanted to know why was I doing this? And I told him the truth. And I think the truth always works. You know, people can sense when somebody else is coming to them in truth and in goodwill. And so I went back in 2 weeks. And he said, I'm happy to tell you, Moscow says that we will allow this. You can come and bring your delegation in. When do you want to come? And so that way we went ahead and arranged for ourselves to start making airline tickets, and we got ourselves to the Soviet Union. And we started walking the streets, and nobody stopped us. And we would stop and talk with people on the streets and admire their babies or admire their dogs, and all of a sudden we would be able to have a little conversation with them. And they were relieved and happy to see us there, and we were relieved to find out that they didn't have horns and tails and fangs. And so we had 3 weeks of going to 3 different republics, and during that time we had a completely different picture of what these people are like than we had before we went. And I remember on the way home we said to ourselves in the airplane, what are we going to do with this experience when we get home? And we didn't know, but we decided we would start making public presentations, and we did. And then people started saying, will you take a second trip? Would you take us? And so soon we were making other delegations and forming other delegations and taking off for the Soviet Union again. So this happened throughout the whole 1980s. Actually, it's covered in my book. This book is one part of it is about the 1980s under communism and our crazy dreams and impossible ideas. The second is about the 1990s when the country fell apart. And the third is about the 2000s when, of course, President Putin came in and the country really began to change. So the history is here, if you're interested. And it's a wonderful story of the two enemy peoples coming together in larger and larger ways, and finding out that they really liked each other and that we could work together, that we didn't have to kill each other with these nuclear weapons.
Right. So Sharon, what was your impossible idea?
Well, that was it, that we would be able to create some sort of understanding between the two countries. And we were doing it in the 80s and even in the 90s. It was working. And I was so grateful. It was such a wonderful feeling between all of us. And the Russians were coming here, and wherever they went, there was wonderful reception for them. Yeah, it was really good.
You also started business programs in the USSR. Wasn't this against Soviet law?
Well, it would have been against Soviet law, except Gorbachev had come in, and he was making all sorts of changes in the country. He assumed power in 1985, and by 1986, he was allowing different types of projects and programs. By 1988, he was allowing us to bring Soviet citizens of our choice to American cities. We brought them to 264 different American cities throughout the country. And we said, the enemies need to meet each other. We need to destroy all of these myths between our two countries and know that what happened in the past, but in the future we can be friends.
Your other programs caught the attention of the State Department, I think, and you even got a White House appointment?
Well, yes, but there were many programs and projects in between there that we were running with foundation money and Steve Wozniak's money,
right,
and anybody that would give us money to run these programs. Yeah. And then in 1990, the Clinton administration figured out that we were already running business programs, training Russian entrepreneurs in American countries. And actually, not just Russians, we were training Georgians, Ukrainians, Yerevanis, all sorts of different, all the republics we were bringing people from to train them in business management, or startup business, actually, in the beginning. And so when the Clinton administration realized that we had more experience than anybody in the country, then they were eager to fund us. That was fascinating because they invited us up to the big top of the USAID building and had a wonderful luncheon for us. And the lead person at the table said, "Now, tell me, what kind of money are you looking for?" And I said, "Well, $100,000 would be very wonderful because we could get a lot of work done with that." And the room quietened. And he finally said, "Sharon, we don't do $100,000. What would you do if we gave you $10 million?" And I almost fainted. So that was the way we broke into government funding. But we handled the money very responsibly, I want to tell you.
Right.
And we always required that any Russian coming on any of our programs had to pay for part of it, even though it was small. And so for our business programs, we required that they pay 16%.
So your original impossible idea really blossomed into something that you couldn't possibly have foreseen at the very beginning.
We would have never dreamed it. As a matter of fact, I would have been so frightened I probably would have run the other way because, I had to learn all kinds of new things in order to be, and had, it was a total learning experience for me. 45 degrees up every day, every month, every year.
Yeah, Americans, I think, are keenly aware that there has been corruption going on in Russia, and I think it probably got a bit worse after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990. Could you talk to us a bit about what Americans perceive as corruption in Russia?
Well, I think Americans today still think that the corruption is as bad as it ever was. I have a different picture of that because I work with Russia's entrepreneurs and I watch the country pretty carefully. But just for a little background, let me say that Russia has always been what we would call a corrupt country because they had practices that were normal to them that we would call corruption today. For instance, bureaucrats in Tsarist Russia always expected something from somebody who wanted a favor from them or wanted some kind of action from the government. And so everybody was accustomed to paying off small amounts in some cases and large amounts in some cases. So this was just under the table, as they call it. This had gone on forever. And then in the 1990s, when everything broke loose and the country was independent from the other republics and and nobody knew how to lead. And the oligarchs, the young oligarchs, began grabbing these big, huge, multi-billion-dollar companies and privatizing them to their own pockets. And people were murdering each other, and corruption was absolutely, it was horrible. And the country was lawless. It wasn't a matter of corruption, it was just a matter of total lawlessness and chaos. So anything went during the 90s. We didn't have any clue how to stop this, even though we were working with the entrepreneurs closely and trying to help them understand how to deal with the bureaucrats without losing their business to them. But Putin came into office, and my great interest in him at first was that he called the oligarchs in, the ones who had gotten these businesses and privatized them to themselves, and basically said to them, I know where your money is, I know how you got it, I know what these deals were, I know what you paid for them, and I know where you parked your money. And I want to tell you, if you can handle these enterprises responsibly, and if you will stay out of politics, and if you will pay taxes on your revenues, then you can keep these businesses as long as you do this. But if you don't, you're in big trouble. So he gave them fair warning, and frankly, it was the best deal that could have ever happened in the world, because nobody's been able to get those kinds of billion-dollar enterprises privatized to them and keep them. It was amazing. So at any rate, that began to handle some of the corruption, but still corruption was all over. It was endemic all over the business sectors. And it began just one law after another that was put in that began making different ways that the bureaucrats were getting money from the businesses less able to do this. Now, I was following it very closely because we had an anti-corruption program then, and we were trying so hard to help these Russian entrepreneurs not lose their businesses to these bureaucrats. And it's covered in my book pretty carefully, but too long a subject to go into today. But what the result of it has been that corruption has been gradually reduced in Russia. The entrepreneurs tell me now that in the small and medium-sized companies, the bureaucrats really don't bother them anymore. As a matter of fact, they're helpful to them. The bureaucrats are getting better salaries, that helps. But also, they realize that there's not any way that Russia can develop a decent economy if it's not going to be able to have a good small and medium-sized, unimpeded business sector. So I think now, I know it's headed in a constructive direction. As far as Sochi and these big projects, I don't have a clue what kinds of corruption has gone on there, if it has, or how much it's been. I just read what everybody else reads in the newspapers. Mm-hmm. So I can't speak on that.
Right. Sharon, I heard that you met with Vladimir Putin before he came to power. How did this happen, and what was your impression of him?
Well, yes, I did meet with him. It was strictly by accident. I had a program that I wanted to run, and I knew that this was iffy. So I went to the Mariinsky City Hall in St. Petersburg and asked for somebody to please give me guidance on whether this program was possible or not. It's the first time I'd ever done this, but this was really kind of off the radar. I was always looking for the big idea, something that would make the next big splash. And so I got an appointment with this bureaucrat. And I knew he was a Soviet bureaucrat, or else he wouldn't have been in this office, because there was not anybody else to run City Hall then. And so I described the program that I wanted to run. He listened very carefully, was very impersonal, was zeroed in on my proposal, and went from question to question, really good questions, asking me to please give him more information. And so every time I gave him an answer, he gave me another question. And I realized this man has a superior mind. I've not ever dealt with a Soviet bureaucrat like this one. And so I was thinking that he was going to allow me to run the program. And of course, he would probably ask for a bribe. And we got to the end of the session, and he said, Mrs. Tennison, I think that this is a really good program. But at this moment, I cannot give my permission. It's just not legal now by the laws that we have. Maybe in 2 years it'll be okay. So maybe you can come back then. He showed me to the door. I walked out on the street with my friend who went with me, and I said to Volodya, this is the first time we've ever met with a Soviet bureaucrat that he didn't ask us for something big. What's with this guy? We walked off and didn't think about it again. Except I did look at his business card, and it said Vladimir V. Putin on it. And I remember thinking, that's a strange name for a Russian name. Where'd that come from? End of story. I never thought about it again until I read the New York Times in 1999 and saw that a Putin was going to be would be probably the next candidate for presidency of Russia. I didn't take it seriously. I just mentally said to myself, what's the second time I've heard this name, Putin? The next day the photo came out, and I was able to see the face that I had met with earlier. And I realized that this man was going to be president of Russia. I was shocked. And so I told my friends, this is the biggest disaster for Russia I can imagine. This guy can't run. He doesn't have the personality to run a presidency for Russia. And they asked why, and I just said, because he's too introvertish and he's too intelligent. I think what I meant by that was, I felt like that what I had experienced of him was not a palsy kind of thing, which usually the Soviet bureaucrats were. They wanted to be palsy so they could get bribes. Putin was not palsy. He was just simply very intent upon my proposal. And I thought, he doesn't have the warmth that he needs to be the president of Russia. And so, but what could I do? Nothing. So things went on.
Yeah. Sharon, you also met with Putin's Minister of the Economy in the Kremlin. What did you learn about Putin from those meetings?
Good question. I learned a lot about Andrei Ilarionov. I didn't learn much about Putin, I don't think, but I'll describe. Ilarionov at that time was the Minister of Economy. And of course he was very interested in business and relationships and how they could work. And so he was eager to find out everything that he could from us, because we had longer experience working with Russia's small and medium-sized business sector than anybody in the country. And so he was very interested in more information. At one time we took 100 entrepreneurs from 35 regions to the Kremlin to talk with him about what needs to happen next. And I was shocked at that time that he didn't even bother to go to the podium when the 100 were seated. He simply walked over to a short, small table, to plain little brown chair that had been set up for him, I guess, and he sat down with his papers and his pen, and he got ready to write. And he did stand and greet people, and then he said, I would like for any of you to come to the microphone and speak to me about what we need to know in order to develop Russia's small and medium-sized business sectors. Well, Russians looked around at each other and they said, one got up and made a statement, and then another and another. And I think the whole 100 got up before the meeting was over. This lasted about 3.5 hours. And all the while, Andrei Ilarionov was furiously writing, getting all of this information down. He then made a small speech, congratulated them for working in the kinds of climate that they've had to work in. He admired them. It was so obvious that he really admired this group of people that had come all the way to see him from the Far East and other parts of the country. And that was the end of it, except that 2 weeks later we were able to see on Russian television that that Putin himself was talking about some of these points that were made by the Russian entrepreneurs. So it made all of the entrepreneurs across the country realize that somebody was listening in the Kremlin. Now, that tells you something about Ilarionov. It also talks about his boss and how they were struggling to try to figure out how to build a business in Russia, but didn't know themselves. So that's my story.
Yeah. Sharon, how do Russians feel about Americans these days?
It's a very complicated situation, Mel. They always wanted to be like Americans throughout the decades, certainly in the 20th century. They admired us. They tried to figure out who we were and what we were doing. They thought we walked on gold streets. They thought we were totally free, and this was during communist years. And so yeah, we were the chosen people of the planet as far as they were concerned, and they were always so good to us when they met us. And so then things began to change, and actually they began to change when Putin came in. I didn't realize this, but I was chronicling in my book the different things that I was noting that were changing about the attitude in Washington toward Russia. And I kept on trying to do things to change this mentality. I was going to Congress members and having meetings with them. I met with, of course, USAID and State Department. I would with think tanks, and I would take Russians with me, and we would talk to them about the relationship between the two countries. I couldn't figure out why all of a sudden Russia was not in any longer. In, that is. And much later on, several years ago, I asked a high-level State Department person, when did it happen that Washington decided that Russia was not an okay place to be dealing with? And he said, the minute that Vladimir Putin came into the presidency. And I said, what does that have to do with anything? And is it because he was a KGB? And he said, perhaps. And then I said, well, but George Bush, the first, was also CIA head. So that surely couldn't matter. We both agreed that we didn't know why, but he said, I'll tell you, the knives were drawn that very time. And then I looked back and I could see that what I had written in my book was a prelude to what was going to be happening in the country. I'm still not sure what happened, but I have some thoughts on that, and I think at some time I'll do some writing on it.
Okay, all right. Sharon, as I said in the beginning, I'm thinking of taking my camera to Russia and maybe interviewing some Russian people, because I think their views are particularly important now. Americans need to hear what Russians themselves are really feeling. But one question I have is, how will I be accepted if I travel there with my camera?
That's a good question for today. And Mel, I didn't finish answering the question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
On the last answer that I should have given you. So during the 2000s, Russian people were still just enamored with American people, getting as much information as they could from them, whether they were coming here to get it, or whether they were going there to give it. And so things were still working well as far as the people-to-people work went. And in 2007, 8, 9, 10, things began getting much scrappier between the political leaders of both countries. And finally, in probably 2011 or 12, Russian citizens began getting alarmed because they could see that NATO was marching closer to their borders all the time. Obviously, the Russian leaders were concerned about this and were continuing to complain about it. And so the mood became more difficult. But Russians still, anytime they met an American and had any kind of conversation with them, they were totally friendly and not a problem at all. Today, it's a little bit different because we have had such animosity in the media about Russians and Russia. And they read our media. They're big internet readers. They don't pay much attention to their newspapers, but they really are big internet readers. And many of them, of course, read English. And so they've begun to get the flavor of what's going on between our two nations at the top, and are really uncomfortable with what's going on. So as far as you having problems, if you go with a group, you won't have any problems, depending upon what kind of group it is. But there's a withdrawal now from Americans, and the polls show this. And so I would say to you, it would be good if you would create a little 3x5 card or something that says, I'm an American traveling in your country, and I'm interested to know more about your culture, and I'm interested in our countries building friendly relationships or something like this. Get it done in Russian and English on one side, Russian on another, and hand it out. I think this would be a good idea.
Yeah, okay.
But you won't have any trouble getting your camera through the customs or anything like that. That won't be a problem at all.
Right. Now, Sharon, I understand that you're taking another delegation of Americans to Russia soon. What do you expect to happen?
Well, this is a different kind of delegation than we've ever done before. We did hundreds of them in the 80s and didn't do them in the 90s or the 2000s. But now I think it's really important to get much more people contact and having both peoples understand each other's cultures today, not just formerly. And so I'm taking in a group of what I'm calling citizen to citizen, investigators, just finding out what's going on at the local levels in 4 different regions. Have a great group going, and hopefully we'll be able to bring back a lot of information that will help Americans understand how they feel about what's going on in the world today.
Sharon, you've had 33 years of experience with Russia and the Russian people. What do you want Americans to know about Russia and the Russian people at this critical moment in history?
Well, I would love for them to know that Russians are still open to Americans, and they really care about creating a better relationship with our country. And anytime we get together, Russians and Americans have a magic between them, because somehow or another our two cultures have been so different, and yet our humor and our goodwill comes through immediately. And we have better times with Russians than we do with just about anybody on the planet. And so this, I would like them to know, is still intact. As far as Russia goes, what I would like them to know is that Russia is a struggling but a good country today, that they've had only 25 years now to try to build a democracy. That's a short time. We've had over 200 years to build our democracy, and we're still not perfect. So I hope and pray that we will end up with a relationship with Russia that is mutually beneficial to both of us. Because together, these two nations could solve the problems of the 21st century. Apart, things are going to go askew in ways that could be extremely dangerous. We're looking at the possibility of a nuclear conflict with this country. This is the only country in the world that has enough weapons, has the same number of weapons that we have in our nuclear arsenals. They could blow us off of the planet, and we could we could destroy the whole planet if we're not careful. And when they talk about, and there has been some talk about, a limited nuclear strike on Russia, this is totally impossible. Nothing will remain limited. It will be an exchange constantly on both sides for 30 minutes, and then it'll all be over. And then we would be the center traveling in space. We can't afford that.
Yeah. Sharon, you began the program with a quote from Goethe, and it was, "Whatever you can do or dream you can do, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it." That's a wonderful quote, and as I recall, your dream is to somehow establish a win-win relationship between the superpowers. How do you imagine that the message conveyed in this Goethe quote can help the superpowers come to a win-win situation?
Well, to start with, this is my favorite quote. Thank you for using it. It's one that I fell in love with long before I met Russia and the Soviet Union, because I love this idea that boldness, stepping out, acting in goodwill for the benefit of everybody is possible. And not only that, but it brings things that we would have never dreamed to the table. For instance, we could have never dreamed that we would have raised over $60 million to run the programs that we did. This would have been, if anybody had told me this 35 years ago, I would have scoffed at them. And yet we walked out on that bold vision and determined that we were going to make something happen, even though it was limited. And we didn't stop. We just kept on walking out. Every time we got a chance and another door opened, we walked through it. We found a way to get through it, or over a rock, or whatever. We just kept on. This is so important for people to know that this happens, and that there is something in the universe, I don't know what it is, but there's something in the universe that starts bringing things in to people who act with that boldness. It's predictable now to me. And I guess I really look at it in that way, that everybody needs to understand this, so that they don't sit on their backsides and do nothing when they have a chance. And I think this is a time when we really have a chance to do something big, and citizens need to get together again on both sides of the water and begin to build a different type of relationship between our two countries.
Sharon, thank you so much for sharing our dream with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.